Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Nancy Small with the University of Wyoming Department of English, and I'm here to talk to you today about some research that I'm currently doing about rhetoric, storytelling, and public memory. Most people think of English teachers as the ones who check your grammar and your punctuation, or maybe they teach literature, poems, plays, stories, but I'm what's called a rhetorician. And as an English teacher, what I study is how everyday words and other kinds of symbols make our world. So what I'm going to do first is give you a few vocabulary words that relate to my area of study, and then we'll talk about a couple of projects. First, the way I define rhetoric is how symbols make our world. Those symbols can be kind of anything from words and visuals. So when you're scrolling through your Instagram, you're actually immersed in a whole world of rhetoric. But body language, like standing like this looks one way, right? Standing like this looks another. Clothes, buildings, roads, even cities create rhetoric. More on that later. Rhetoric through symbols, particularly I'm interested in storytelling. Storytelling are the everyday things we say to each other about how our day is going. So you tell a story about something you had to eat, or you tell a story about something weird that happened to you. Some people study famous storytellers like politicians on stages, or celebrities, or really big life-changing event stories, but I'm interested in everyday people's storytelling. Those stories converge to form what are called narratives, which are bigger pictures of the everyday events that we all live in. And because we all live in them, those become known as our life worlds, our rhetorical life worlds. Those life worlds tell us things like what to believe, what to value, what to do in certain kind of situations, and even how to belong to a group. So rhetoric tells us how the world is through stories. Let me give you an example from a research project of mine. So before I moved to Laramie, I lived for 6 years in Doha, Qatar, which is next to Saudi Arabia in the Arabian or the Persian Gulf. I was living and working there as a teacher at an international branch campus in Education City. And as I lived there for those years, I got really curious about the stories that me and other expatriates like me told about living there. When we lived in Qatar, the stories we told each other, as well as when we traveled back to the United States, the kinds of things we told to our families and friends. So I interviewed 12 U.S. American expatriate women, just like me, and I asked them to share those stories. What have you heard? What stories do you tell? I ended up with over 120 single-spaced pages of transcripts from those interviews. And what I did was I put them into a computer program, and that computer program allowed me to tag and code them. And through that tagging and coding process, those narrative themes emerged, like I mentioned before. So very gradually, through a lot of thinking and analysis and conversation, I got a sense of what our shared rhetorical life world was like. So after I lived in Qatar for those 6 years, my next stop was Laramie, Wyoming. So let's come on over here and land in our town. This is Laramie today, and a picture from outside the University of Wyoming. After I've lived here a few years, I became interested in these kinds of storytelling practices here locally. The town here is really cool because it's very historical. It was created in 1868 when the railroad came through, and a lot of towns were actually created this way. That's why you see in the picture, the top of the screen, you see the railroad train at one side. Those tracks came through, and then the town was designed to be situated next to them. So if you ever watch movies or TV shows of the Old West, with the dirt streets and the horse and wagons and the cowboys in their chaps and the ladies in the fancy dresses, that was actually Laramie back then. That's not the way Laramie is today. It's a lot different. What you see in that downtown are lots of really cool shops, places to eat, fun things to do. So it's a really neat place to live. But I'm interested in how it looking like an old town actually helps us connect with issues of the past and bring them into the present. So let me show you a little bit more. A few more words. I'm sorry, I'm an English teacher. I deal in words, but this present project adds 4 ideas onto that rhetoric and storytelling that I showed you before. First, we think of history as a kind of linear and official recounting of events that have happened in communities, and it's usually stable. We think of history as facts that don't change. I'm interested in history in relationship to memory. Memory does change because memories can be individual, they can be familial, they can be community-wide. So as people are born, they share their stories when they die, those memories can change. So I'm interested in how memories and history weave together to give us ideas, rhetoric, about places. So that's material culture and embodiment. Material culture are how the places and spaces around us influence how we act, and embodiment is about being bodies in those spaces. So you're going to see strains of these other 4 ideas woven throughout the upcoming project. So how do I get information for these? Well, my research comes from old things and from new things. Part of my research uses archival materials, and what you see here on the screen is you see a headline from the Laramie Daily Sentinel from 1870, so old newspapers, diaries, letters, things like that. You also see a suffrage stamp, the little golden rectangle on one side of the screen, so more kind of paper materials, but you also see a picture of a little tiny baby dress. That baby dress was made by the lady I'm about to introduce you to. And although I didn't get to touch the dress because it's very fragile, I used high quality digital images to zoom in on the stitches and the way the dress is constructed to get a sense of what her personality must have been like. Was she neat and precise and very controlled? Did she improvise? Like, what was it like for her to make this dress, and how can I learn something about her as the maker of the dress? Then new things. I visit the site I'm going to take you to frequently. In fact, I was there just 2 days ago to make a video, and I learned something fun that I'll share with you in just a minute. And finally, that blurry picture of the people are some people gathered at the space we're going to go to, and I interview people who go there to find out their impressions. So it isn't just my impression of the space, it's also everyday contemporary people's impressions of it too. Now, back to the streets of Laramie. This is a picture I took last year standing in an intersection downtown. You can see kind of down to the right side of the street, there's a couple of green trees. That's toward the railroad track. So what's interesting here is the town actually hasn't changed much. Let me show you a picture in the same spot from over 100 years ago. Pretty cool. The buildings are actually mostly the same. The streets are dirt. There's not automobile cars, but there's a few people on the streets. And you can actually kind of get the sense that it's the same space just across time. What this is referred to, if you blur your eyes, is circling through time. So in other words, when you're standing in downtown Laramie, the rhetoric of the built environment gives you the sense that you can imagine history in this space. One of my favorite scholars, Krista Ratcliffe, has a book called Rhetorical Listening, and these ideas come from there, but it's something that's very important to the location I'm studying in my project. You can feel related to things that happened in the past because the environment feels like you, your own body, could be in that past too. So now I'm going to take you down that street on the left, not toward the railroad tracks. All right, this is a little video that I made just a couple of days ago, and I'm going to get it to play. We're walking along following next to the shops. And in a minute, you're going to see we're going to suddenly come to a space. That's because one of the buildings burned down and some people bought that space and they made a courtyard out of it. So as we're walking along and there's a solid wall, suddenly that's broken and it's like a space of curiosity. You're like, oh, wait, what happened? There's no building here. What is this? That notion of curiosity is a big rhetorical draw. It invites us in. But also look, there's this really tall fence, and I actually had to hold the camera up to get it to the view you see at the very end. So we have this weird tension, rhetorical tension. We are invited in through curiosity, but the fence stops us from going there. So we have these really interesting mixed messages as shown in this video. Now, usually this fence is locked, but when I went there 2 days ago, I had a fantastic surprise, which shows that these kind of places we live in are living also. They change too. Here's what happened. I got there expecting the fence to be locked, but the fence was actually open. And you'll see by the way that the gates turn inward, it's like welcoming you, like 2 arms going, please go inside. There's the sidewalk that's kind of like a red carpet, and it leads you up to the statue, the site of public memory that I'm interested in studying. So I'm going to play you this really fast video so that you also can be welcomed into this space. It's cool to think about these as living because it means that even if I write something now, I go back, there might be something new to think about later, right? So now we've arrived at the statue. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn about it the same way a typical visitor would learn about it, only using the stuff on the statue itself, right? These are pictures that I took last summer. So we walk up, we look down at the plaque because there's no other information surrounding the statue. The plaque says, the title, which is The Franchise by John D. Baker, the title The Franchise refers to recognition and bestowal of the right of women to vote under full civic equality with men. In 1869, Wyoming became the first state in the territory to grant this right. Now, before continuing on, I need to say, when the United States was first formed, only certain white men could vote in elections. But that eventually became a problem because women and other folks of different ethnic and racial identities, they wanted to have a say in their communities too. Wyoming's territorial government, it was before it was even a state, thought about this and decided that that was a fair thing that everyone should have. So it was made a law. Anyone that was a citizen, 21 years and older, could vote in the elections. However, that law of enfranchisement didn't include everybody. Native tribal peoples lived all over these lands. The site where Laramie and the University of Wyoming is located actually occupies the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and Shoshone. These folks and other Native folks did not count as citizens in the United States until 1924. That was over 50 years after this historic vote that the plaque commemorates. So the concept of being enfranchised is actually really complicated. We can't talk about it too much more outside the scope of my project, but I don't want you to feel like it's as simple as, oh, everyone now gets to vote. It wasn't quite that simple. Now back to the plaque. It continues by saying, this act was inspirational to both the women's suffrage movement and to the cause of civil rights throughout the nation. The 19th Amendment, that's the official change to the United States Constitution, and it wouldn't be ratified until 1920, 50 years later. In other words, Wyoming was 50 years ahead of the rest of the United States. When most people think of the history of the U.S. and the women's suffrage movement, the fight for the vote, they think of places in the Northeast, places like Washington, D.C., New York, and New Jersey, when in reality, the biggest gains in women's suffrage took part right where we're standing in the West. Other states like Colorado, the Dakotas, Montana, and Utah had similar kinds of movements before the East did. So let's end. The last paragraph in the plaque says, it tells us what we need to know about the lady in the statue. 70-year-old Louisa Swain became the world's first woman voter when she cast her ballot 1 block from this site on the morning of September 7, 1870. This memorial commemorates and celebrates that historic vote. So that's all we get in terms of written information about this site. Let's read the statue. Let's read this material rhetoric to see what else we can learn. So, Swain is a small person. She's not about over 5 feet tall, about 150 centimeters. And so we normally think of our heroes as having like a big physical presence, but she's not. She's little. Her clothes, she's wearing a long cloak or coat over her house clothes, which would be like an apron that she would use to do chores or cook. So a frilly bonnet is also covering her head very modestly, and it's very neatly tied with a bow under her chin. She's also portrayed as very elderly. You can see in that middle picture that around her forehead and her mouth are deep wrinkles and lines. Her hair is very plain. Her shoulders, you're going to see in a minute, or you can see in the larger picture, her shoulders are sloped. And if you look at the way her clothes fit around her wrists, they look large, like she is a shrunken person that her clothes have grown too big for. So let's think about these things and what they tell us about Louisa Swain. That they tie her very closely to her domestic duties as a woman. She's older, so probably a grandmother, and that bonnet says she might be a Quaker, which is a group of people that were known to value peace and pacifism, although they also held values of abolition, anti-slavery, and in favor of women's voting. In her hands, she's carrying that little tiny yeast pail, a little bucket where you buy the ingredients for bread. So in other words, Swain is portrayed as embodying the domestic gone out into public. She's really kind of carrying the house with her, her cloak, her bonnet, covering her, keeping her private, carrying her yeast pail. But in the twist, in her hand, she also has a piece of paper and either a pen or a pencil, which this is her actual showing the action of the vote. So even as Grandma Swain is staying in her lane as a woman, she's also stepping out to now have her legal say in some community decision-making. Remember that during this time in U.S. American history, women being out in public and having their say was actually considered pretty risky. It could hurt your reputation, and it was actually considered counter to a lady's sensibilities. It might make them faint or swoon to be out in public. So having Louisa Swain, little grandma, out in public doing this vote is an interesting act of maintaining the domestic, but also extending beyond the domestic. One more set of slides. We can look here at her body language. Notice how the statue is leaning forward. We can barely see her feet, but it looks like she might be taking a step towards somewhere. And her eyes, they're actually focused well in the distance. If you stand in front of the statue, she's not looking at you. She's looking way far away. So in her body language and her gaze, she's headed towards something, some kind of future progress, which is really interesting, and it kind of captures the spirit of that vote. So this is all we can find out from the statue and the site itself. But remember, I do that archival research. So who is this little lady with her ballot and her yeast pail? What could she be thinking about the years ahead? Well, here's a photo I have of her that was photocopied from a portrait that was taken before she died. You can see that she has those deep lines and wrinkles on her face. Her shoulders are slanted. She's got on her bonnet. She's got on her cloak, so she's very modest. You can see her bony hands. So we get the sense that the statue was modeled in a very realistic way on what Swain looked like. Here's what we know about her biography. First, she was born in 1801 to a Quaker family, so indeed she is Quaker, which would have been a peace-loving, a pacifist family most likely. But both her parents died by the time she was 10, and she spent the next 10 years in an orphanage in South Carolina, so she would have been exposed to different people and ideas there. She married a man named Stephen Swain, who was a furniture maker when she was 21 years old, or 1820, and they together had 5 children. Those children grew up, and one of them, Alfred, got married and decided to move out west. He got on one of those first trains that came and ended at Laramie in 1868. Well, I guess that Stephen and Louisa thought that was pretty cool because they decided to come visit the next year. Now, that train journey was long. It was across the United States. It wasn't just like you jump on an airplane today. Remember that Wyoming suffrage law, right? That happened in December of 1869, so after she arrived in Laramie. About 9 months later, she cast that historic vote that gets her commemorated for this statue. But then Grandma Swain and Stephen decided to return east not long after that vote happened. Again, that's like 1,800 miles or 2,900 kilometers. So these were not just quick decisions. I have Grandma Swain on there to remind me to tell you that she became, in that short time, very beloved in the town. In the other newspapers, she is referred to as Grandma Swain. And even when her death is mentioned in a later newspaper, she's still called Grandma. So she must have held a very special place in the community here. Shortly after they arrived back in Maryland to live with other family, Stephen died just a couple of years later, and then Louisa passed away in 1880. One last little thing from my archive I have to share with you is a newspaper report on the day of her historic vote. So this was published in the Laramie Daily Sentinel on September 7, 1870, later that same day. And what I want to do is just read a section of it so that you can hear the rhetoric that's used about this historic moment. The polls here were open at just as early an hour as, by the fastest time the law would permit. And as soon as they were declared open, Mrs. Louisa A. Swain, a lady 70 years of age, walked up and deposited her vote, it being first here and probably the first ever deposited in the world by a lady at a general election. Mrs. Swain is an old lady of the highest social standing in our community and universally beloved and respected. And the scene was in the highest degree interesting and impressive. There was too much good sense in our community for any jests or sneers to be seen on such an occasion. So let's think about, there's a lot actually packed into that little announcement that's in that box. To begin with, they established the ethos or the credibility of how this is a legal vote. It was the earliest possible time the polls could legally open. That kind of implies that, and look, we have a legal voter. Mrs. Swain, her actual vote, though, is portrayed in kind of just quick and mundane terms. She walked up and deposited her vote. In other words, it wasn't really that big of a deal for a woman to vote, just like men can vote, right? She's then described as an old lady, highest social standing, universally beloved and respected. So that idea of her as a respectable woman is really foregrounded here. In fact, she's so respectful that the guys hanging around the pole, maybe they'd been out at the bar all night, they knew better than to sneer or jest at a woman voting because it was Grandma Swain. Now, we don't know what this means about what if a young woman came, what if a 25-year-old prostitute came and would like to have voted? Would they have treated her with that same level of respect? We don't know because we have Swain's story, but not a bigger story of the day. So, my research invites kind of a series of rethinkings. For example, my project invites rethinking about the story of U.S. suffrage and where important events took place. Wyoming is often left out. It also invites rethinking about what a strong activist woman looks like. And the picture you see here is kind of a stereotypical picture you see of women's suffrage. It's in Washington, D.C. The women are dressed very proudly. They have on their high heel shoes. They're carrying their signs and they're marching down the street. Compare that to little Miss Swain with her sloped shoulders and her yeast pail. What counts as an activist woman? Maybe it's more complicated than we usually think about. Finally, a lot is made about Swain being the first voter to vote, not in the world, how can we know, but certainly the first woman voter recorded in the United States. But her being celebrated as the first also erases other people. For example, I found in a newspaper article that there were 3 African American women that voted the same day in Cheyenne, which is just 45 miles down the road. Now let's think about that. 1870, the U.S. Civil War had only recently ended, and slavery, Wyoming was not a slave state, but slavery in the United States had just recently been abolished. And 45 miles from here, we had a group of African American women cast their votes. I would love to know their names and their stories, but because they weren't first, and maybe because of the color of their skin, we can't know, they were lost to history. So some stories end up counting more than others. One more rethinking it invites us to do is about our places of public memory. What does a locked gate, and this is what the space that I took you to that was open today, this is what it usually looked like. What does that locked gate do to a story that's otherwise about freedom and empowerment? And what does the lack of information in the space do to actually work against getting Swain's story out? Finally, I'm going to take you really quickly to one more important site of public memory in Laramie. This is a beautiful mural project commemorating different activists across time. But look where it's located in this alley. The people who created this space and the paintings had amazing intentions and beautiful hearts and a lot of talent. But the space around it is just kind of yuck. And so you go to it and you get these mixed messages again about who are we celebrating, but where are we celebrating them? I just want to do a quick plug if you'd like to learn more. Another story about Wyoming, you see that group of people kind of down the way in white shirts. That is the Black 14. For another story that's really fantastic about kind of who we are as a society, how we can think better, know better, and do better, visit their website at www.black14.net. It's really compelling and I strongly recommend it. They're amazing men and many of them are still alive, so this is living history as well. So, bigger picture, who cares about all this? Like, what does me doing this kind of study as a scholar do for me and for my students and for other scholars? Well, we learn to read and listen in different ways. We become more attuned to the rhetorical life worlds that we share with other people. We begin to think more carefully about how the material world shapes us and to reconsider how our remembering together highlights some things but erases others. Finally, it brings forth stories of quieter places in the world. Whether it's Laramie, Wyoming, Doha, Qatar, or wherever you live, these are portable ideas. They're movable. They can be applied to any kind of space and yield really rich and interesting rethinking and then learning about better ways to live together. So, thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Dr. Nancy Small, and I'm with the University of Wyoming's Department of English. If you'd like to learn more about our programs, visit us at www.uwyo.edu/English. Thanks.